So I don't know what you mean by why was it so important. It wasn't important.
Well, you still don't know where it started? The guys you gave money to figured it out in 3 days.
No.
Mr. Anderson said on January 31st, 2020, virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory. The very next day, Dr. Gary said, I don't know how this happens in nature. It'd be easy to do in a lab. And then 3 days later, Shazam, they switch and say it has to be nature. So they figured it out in 3 days, but you still don't know?
No, in fact, if you look at what they were saying, Congressman Jordan, they were saying that it was not a manufactured virus. It still could have evolved out of a lab.
Well, let me read something here to you.
They're not incompatible.
In our study on the censorship of the Biden administration working with big tech, I want to read you a WhatsApp message from Mark Zuckerberg. Can we include that the White House put pressure on us to censor the lab leak theory? So this is a communication on July 16th, 2021. Nick Clegg, Joel Kaplan, Sheryl Sandberg, Mark Zuckerberg. They're certainly feeling the pressure to downplay any lab leak theory and go with the natural origin theory.
Is there a question there?
One's coming. Here's another email to Mark Zuckerberg. It says, subject line, COVID misinformation, Wuhan lab leak theory. In response to continued public pressure and tense conversations with the new administration, we started removing 5 COVID claims, including the lab leak theory. Mr. Zuckerberg responds, this seems like a good reminder that when we compromise our standards due to pressure from an administration in either direction, we often later regret it. Why was it so important the virus not have started in a lab?
Wasn't so important that the virus not. We don't know. We know
it was important to someone in the Biden administration, so much so that the top people at Meta, the top people at Facebook are asking, why are we getting all this pressure to downplay the lab leak theory? And we have an email from June of the same year, June 4th, 2021, saying the same thing. It was certainly important to somebody.
Well, what has that got to do with me?
I'm asking you because you're the expert on the coronavirus. I'm saying why was the administration so pushing not to have the lab leak theory as something that was viable?
I can answer that. I've kept an open mind throughout the entire process.
You kept an open mind. Dr. Fauci, open mind.
That is correct.
What happened in those 3 days? Why did Dr. Anderson and Mr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, why did they change their mind in 180 degrees? Because what Christian Anderson says 3 days later, after he said virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory, 3 days later he says the main crackpot theories going around at the moment relate to this virus being somehow engineered, and that is demonstrably false. How did they figure all that out in 3 days, Dr. Fauci?
You can do that.
Still have an open mind.
Well, what they did is that they testified before this committee. What they did, they went back and looked at the sequences and realized that their initial concern was unfounded about that, and it did not look at all like it was manufactured. But as they said in their paper, even though they feel it was more likely—
3 days, they figured it out.
That's exactly. You could do that in 3 days. You can scan sequences in a day. You don't need 3 days.
Okay, who's Robert Redfield?
The former director of the CDC.
Dr. Redfield, right? And he was also on the coronavirus task force. Is that accurate?
He was a member of the coronavirus task force.
And here's what he said to this committee. He said, Redfield said that Fauci and Collins left him out because Redfield suspected that coronavirus had leaked from the Chinese lab. Is that accurate?
Well, he said that, but that's not true.
That
is incorrect, Congressman.
Dr. Redfield's lying to the committee when he sat right where you sat?
When he said that I kept him out, that is an incorrect statement. The roster who was on the phone—
Was Dr. Redfield in that conference call on February 1st when you had Mr. Anderson and Dr. Gary on that call?
He was not. And the conference call was put together by Jeremy Farrar. So no one kept him out. He said he was kept out because he felt—
Did U.S. tax dollars—
You want me to answer the question?
Yeah, I would just wonder why he wasn't on the call. It seems to me the head of CDC, part of the coronavirus task force, which was formed 2 days prior to that call, would have been on the call.
Well, the call was arranged by Jeremy Farrar. You should ask him.
Okay. Did U.S. tax dollars flow through a grant recipient to the lab in China?
I'm sorry, what was—
Did U.S. tax dollars flow through a grant recipient to the lab in China?
Yes, of course. It was a sub-award to the Wuhan Institute.
And who approved that award?
Excuse me?
And who approved that award? What agency approved that award?
National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases.
Your agency approved that, right?
Yes, it did. After—
Did that have anything to do with this downplaying of the lab leak theory?
No.
Nothing to do with it?
Nothing.
What? Do you agree that there was a push to downplay the lab leak theory?
Not on my part.
Really?
Really?
Wow.
Wow.
I think most of the country would find that amazing. I still got 11 seconds.
Well, look at the facts. I've kept an open mind throughout the entire process.
All right, I yield back.
I now recognize the majority staff for no longer than 30 minutes of questions.
Dr. Fauci, it's good to see you again. I want to ask a couple questions about some of the members' questions and then get into some follow-ups. The issue of the CIA trip was brought up. That was brought to us by a whistleblower. That was not an allegation made by the committee. It was an allegation made by the whistleblower. You testified at a transcribed interview back in early January. Do you recall me asking you about that allegation?
About the going to the CIA?
Yes, sir. And do you recall, and you denied it then as well, and you denied it here today, do you recall the subcommittee publishing that you denied it?
I don't recall.
We did.
You did, okay.
We put it out in a press release afterwards that you denied the whistleblower's allegation. And then today, during the course of the last couple hours, have any members on the majority side of the dais asked you about a trip to the CIA?
Yeah.
They have?
No, they have. I'm sorry, Mitch, I'm not hearing this so well.
Have
I have a point of order, Mr. Chairman.
What's the gentleman's point of order?
I have an inquiry about whether or not I'm hearing things or whether or not you just yielded 30 minutes of committee time to staff.
That is correct, both sides.
And the question that the gentleman just raised was a question that I raised. So apparently he was not listening when I was questioning Dr. Fauci.
Thank you for your point of order. You may continue.
What I asked was, we asked you about this in a transcribed interview. You testified that you did not go to the CIA. We published that you refuted that allegation. And then today, no members of the Republican side of the dais have asked you that question. Is that accurate? Thank you. You've been asked a number of times about your former senior advisor, Dr. Morin's, and have said, and I want to make sure I characterize it correctly because it goes a little back and forth, that you didn't conduct official business over a personal email with Dr. Morin's. Has Dr. Morin's emailed your personal email before on non-official purposes?
As I mentioned, we wrote scientific papers together, so he very well may have used that. Of course, that's the email I use when I write a scientific paper, right?
And that's because NIAID policy allows you to write on semi-official time, write papers, but you just have to put a disclaimer that this is not the view of
in other
NIH.
words, if you're doing something as official business, you shouldn't use your emails that are your official business. So in order to be compliant with the regulations, you would use a personal email.
I appreciate it. I want to ask about some of the public health policies enacted during the pandemic. Dr. Francis Collins, the former NIH director, recently said in an interview, and I'm quoting, you attach an infinite value to stopping the disease and saving a life. You attach a zero value to whether this actually totally disrupts people's lives, ruins the economy, and has kept many kids out of school in a way that they never quite recovered. Understanding the COVID task force had a lot of voices at the table, is that an accurate description of the public health advisors, and then you could fit in other advisors along the way?
Yeah, Mitch, what I believe that Dr. Collins was saying was that we give advice based on pure public health issues. It's very, very clear now, retrospectively, looking at the potential collateral negative effects of things like mandating. It would be important for us now, since the purpose of, I believe, why we're here, is to how we can do better next time, is to consider the balance. I think things that we did in the beginning were in the context of horrible situation of 4,000 to 5,000 deaths per day. But that doesn't mean that you don't go back and look and say, did everything we do at that point and the duration for which we did it, was that appropriate, and do we need to re-examine? I believe that's what Dr. Collins was referring to. And I agree with him on that.
And you got to my next question, that we are here trying to figure out how to do better next time, lose
Yes.
fewer lives next time. Would that be a better thought process going forward of thinking about the possible unintended consequences of public health measures?
Absolutely.
And you've heard from both sides of the dais today, first weeks, months, novel virus, nobody knew what was going on, called for some drastic measures. Once there was a better understanding of who the most affected demographics were, do you think it would be important to more narrowly craft public health measures to specifically favor those demographics?
The answer is yes, but you have to be careful, because if you have a certain group that is being predominantly afflicted, if you're really, really clear that another group is really quite protected, then you should fashion it demographically related. But what often happens with outbreaks is that they're a moving target, and you only hear about other vulnerables as you get further into the outbreak. So the answer to your question is you're partially correct that you need to do that, but you've got to be careful when you're dealing with a moving target.
And we can appreciate that. You've been asked a little bit again about the theories of natural immunity and herd immunity. Those are both real scientific theories in infectious disease, is that correct?
Yes.
And between infection-acquired immunity and vaccinated-acquired immunity, did the United States hit herd immunity?
The answer is no, and I've written a paper on that, is that when you're dealing, and just let me take 30 seconds, I don't want to run out the clock on you, but I think it's important to make this point. When you talk about herd immunity, it's predicated on two principles: that you're dealing with a pathogen that's not changing, and number two, that when you either get infected or vaccinated, the duration of the immunity is measured in decades, if not a lifetime. So that if you have a pathogen that stays the same, like measles doesn't change. So I was infected with measles when I was a child. It's the same measles that's infecting people in certain countries in the developing world. Number two, when you get either infected or vaccinated with measles, you have immunity that's durable minimally in decades and possibly for life. So if you get the same pathogen and you get a large percentage of the people who have either been infected or vaccinated, then you have herd immunity. We did not ever have that with COVID.
And you've also been asked a number of times about the vaccine and vaccine mandates. Were you the one that recommended to the president to mandate vaccines for certain individuals?
No.
Do you know who did?
No, it was more of it was a combination of a group and just saying that, certain agencies like the Labor Department or what have you would feel that this would to be done. But it was not like I one day said, hey, we should mandate vaccines. That did not happen.
And I want to echo the comments of the chairman that we agree the vaccine saved hundreds of thousands of lives. And we talked about this a little bit in January, and I think you touched on it a little bit today. Could issuing these mandates and removing the notion of informed consent from some certain sects of the citizenry lead to vaccine hesitancy?
Yeah, I mentioned this, I believe, in the TI, that as a matter of fact, that's something that I think we need to go back now when we do an after the event evaluation about whether or not, given the psyche of the country and the pushback that you get from those types of things, we need to reevaluate the cost-benefit ratio of those types of things.
And then I won't belabor the point, but we talked about the 6-foot distance an awful lot today. Do you recall if it was ever suggested to be 10 feet?
I don't recall, Mitch, if it was ever suggested it was 10 feet, but when I made my explanation of what it was, I was saying that there was no trial that looked at 10 versus 6 versus 3 versus not even worrying about it at all.
And you said today that there were discussions at the White House about the 6-foot rule. You don't recall if it was discussions about whether or not it should be 3 or should be 10 or should be 6?
I don't recall, Mitch, what the exact discussion was, but as I've said in response to multiple questions, what we had, the CDC was said that on the basis of their evaluation, which was based on the droplet approach, that 6 foot would be to go. And since there was no clinical trials going one way or the other, that's why it was accepted by the group.
And then it hasn't been a large topic today, and we talked about kind of, again, the many unknowns in early 2020. Schools were closed through the semester. Some schools reopened for the fall semester. Some remained closed going through into 2021. Looking back, are there current academic ramifications of remote schooling or kids not being in school?
I think there have been a number of, I know, that there have been a number of studies to show that there are lasting effects, at least up to this point. They tend to attenuate over time, but there have been substantial negative effects on learning and on children when you keep them out of school for a prolonged period of time.
Have you seen any studies suggesting physical health ramifications?
I haven't seen physical health ramifications.
Mental health?
I believe that there are some that show psychological issues that relate to keeping kids out of the environment, of the social environment of the school.
And apologize for bouncing around. We don't have 14 hours with you today. I've got 30 minutes, so
I'm so sorry about that.
I'm gonna move quickly.
Yeah.
Again, across the dais, both sides of the aisle, a lot of questions on the origins of COVID and finding out the origins and how that could better lead to both protecting against spillover and wildlife trade, but also increased biosafety standards. As you sit here today, is it possible that COVID-19 was the result of a laboratory-related accident?
Oh, absolutely. And like I mentioned multiple times, I keep an open mind. I feel, based on the data that I have seen, that the more likely, not definitive, but the more likely explanation is a natural spillover from an animal reservoir. But since there has not been definitive proof one way or the other, we have to keep an open mind that it could be either.
And based on that answer, I think, is the hypothesis that COVID-19 accidentally leaked from a lab a conspiracy theory?
No, I mentioned that several times. Conceptually, the concept of it is not a conspiracy theory.
We've talked a little bit about the proximal origin of SARS-CoV-2, the paper authored by Dr. Anderson. It came to two primary conclusions, and I'm quoting, "Our analysis clearly show that SARS-CoV-2 is not a laboratory construct or a purposefully manipulated virus, and we do not believe that any type of laboratory-based scenario is plausible." Do you disagree with those conclusions?
I think, Mitch, if I'm not mistaken, I don't have the paper in front of me, I think they also said the possibility of if you passaged it, you could have done that.
And
and if you passage it, it's in a lab. So it is, I mean, that could be.
And they dispelled that at the end with we do not believe that any type of laboratory-based scenario is plausible. So I ask again, is a laboratory-based scenario plausible?
Well, I mean, again, I don't want to speak for what they meant in that paper, but I have said multiple times, I keep an open mind that it could be either a laboratory leak or it could be what I think the data is leaning towards mostly, which is a natural occurrence from an animal reservoir.
And this email was brought up too on April 16th, 2020. Dr. Collins wrote to you and said, wondering if there's something NIH can do to help put down this very destructive conspiracy, referencing the lab leak. I hope the Nature Medicine article on the genomic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 would settle this, but probably didn't get much visibility. Anything more we can do? The next day, you were at a White House press conference and cited Proximal Origin and said that Proximal Origin established that COVID-19, quote, is totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to human. Did anyone tell you to cite Proximal Origin from the White House podium?
No, it was in response, I believe, to a question that might have been asked by a reporter, but I wasn't stimulated to say that at all. I was responding to a question.
At that time, back in April of 2020, was it also your belief that a lab leak was possible?
Yeah, I've always had an open mind about it.
And then I want to correct the record again a little bit on the drafting and publication of the Proximal Origin paper. Did Dr. Anderson send you drafts to review?
He sent drafts, but I'm going to jump ahead of you, if I might. dribble around. I did not edit it. It was mentioned by a few of the
It was.
congressmen. I did not edit the paper.
And I appreciate that. I just wanted to get on the record.
Right.
I want to talk about Dr. Morin's and what you wrote in your opening testimony and some of the answers that you gave today. And just for clarity, you were, in addition to being unaware of his use of personal email and potentially intentionally deleting federal records, were you also unaware of his actions to assist Dr. Daszak and EcoHealth?
I was aware of his friendship. I was not aware of his attempts to assist him to respond to an NIH inquiry.
So not aware of the editing of press releases or editing of letters?
No, I was not.
On November 11th, 2021, Dr. Morin's wrote in an email to Dr. Daszak that he attempted to discuss the EcoHealth grant with you, and you, quote, got upset and told him to have no more communications with Peter. Why did you tell Dr. Morin's to no longer communicate with Dr. Daszak?
Because I think it's inappropriate to do what he did. I mean, and your committee has called him out very definitively about that, and it was inappropriate to do that.
This is back in 2021.
Right.
What did you know about what he was doing then?
I didn't know exactly what he was doing, but I don't think it's inappropriate for people to be communicating and helping a grantee in a response. I didn't know exactly what he was doing, but I didn't think it was appropriate.
When did you testified to Chairman Griffith, or excuse me, Chairman Comer, that you knew about the compliance issues later on with
Right.
EcoHealth? When did you first become aware?
I became aware during briefings by my staff in preparation for congressional hearings, well after the fact where the compliance issues actually happened. That, I mean, I didn't know, as I mentioned to you in the TI pitch, I didn't even know the grant existed before the outbreak. And then finally, when there was this issue about congressional hearings, I needed to know, what is this grant? What are we doing with it? And are there any issues? That's when they said there was a compliance problem of the fourth year versus the fifth year progress report.
Some of the other emails from Dr. Morin's, I just want to read into the record and ask you if his recollection is accurate. On April 27th, 2020, Dr. Morin's wrote, "I am sure privately he would love to see Peter and EcoHealth fully restored, although he did once make the comment to me that Peter had screwed himself with the late report. I already told him that all that crap wasn't true." The late report was true, despite what Dr. Morin said. On April 21st, 2021, Dr. Morin's wrote that he was sure you would do anything you could to restore the funds to EcoHealth. On June 5th, 2021, Dr. Morin's wrote that you were working behind the scenes to undo the damage to EcoHealth. On October 21st, 2021, Dr. Morin's wrote, "Peter, I had my regular meeting with Tony this morning. He immediately inquired about you and several times asked how you were doing. He used a lot of colorful language about the situation with attacks on EcoHealth." On October 25th, 2021, Dr. Morin's wrote that you were trying to protect EcoHealth. On March 22nd, 2021, Dr. Morin's wrote, "The most important is within NIH to get the decision reversed and the grant refunded. I believe Tony would like to do this." And on February 24th, 2022, Dr. Morin's wrote, "It will be a small consolation to hear the following, but in my face-to-face meeting with Tony this morning, he once again brought up, as he usually does, your plight, Peter." Did you ever have any discussions with Dr. Morin's about protecting EcoHealth or helping restore funding?
Not at all. I don't know what, to be honest with you, Mitch, I just don't know what Dr. Morin's is talking about with that. Maybe he's trying to, as he said, cheer up. He said that in front of this committee, cheer up Dr. Daszak. But to say that I'm getting involved in trying to help him or protect him, not so.
Did you ever have any conversations with Dr. Morin's about what Dr. Daszak was facing or about the termination of the grant?
You know, he may have mentioned to me something like Dr. Daszak is going through terrible times, but I don't recall. It is conceivable that he would have mentioned that to me because, as he mentioned to you, that Dr. Daszak and he are very good friends. So it would not be surprising if sometime he had mentioned to me, boy, Dr. Daszak's going through some really tough times. Fine, that doesn't mean that I say you should help him.
No, absolutely doesn't. So that's why we want to ask the questions and
Yes.
get the answers. During your transcribed interview with us, you were asked about whether or not Dr. Daszak had a conflict of interest in reviewing the origins of COVID-19, and you testified, I hesitate to speculate about what someone else should do. The only people that I am involved with is my own staff, who we've mentioned many times in this discussion, who don't have a conflict of interest. With the benefit of hindsight and the work of this committee, do you believe Dr. Morenz had a conflict of interest regarding EcoHealth?
Well, from what we know now, he definitely had a conflict because he was communicating with a grantee of helping him in response to an NIH issue, which is a conflict of interest. I did not know that at the time when I made your statement.
And I appreciate that. That's,
Yeah.
Sticking with EcoHealth, in April 2020, NIH terminated and then subsequently reinstated and then suspended the EcoHealth grant that had the Wuhan Institute as a sub-grantee. Do you recall that decision?
Yes.
Were you involved at all in that decision?
No.
You previously testified to House Energy and Commerce that you were, in essence, told to cancel the grant. Do you recall who told you?
We got it from a number of, now retrospectively we found out how it was. It was the White House told the department to tell the NIH to cancel the grant.
Did you agree with the cancellation?
What is that? Do we need to listen to that? Okay.
He was escorted out.
Yeah. Okay, good. I'm sorry, repeat the question, Mitch.
Did you agree with the cancellation?
It wasn't a question of agreeing or disagreeing. It was like, can we really do that? I don't think that you can do that. And as it turned out, I was right because the general counsel of HHS said, by the way, you can't do that. You've got to restore the grant.
And that's why they restored it and then suspended it pending the
Yes.
compliance review.
Exactly.
Not to keep reading Dr. Morenz's emails, but on June 24th, 2020, Dr. Morenz wrote an email. He, referencing you, made some additional comments to the effect that this came from the White House and he was totally opposed to it. You weren't totally opposed to it?
Well, see, that's his, he's doing a lot of interpretation, Mitch. His interpretation, I was totally opposed to it. It was more of, can we really legally do that? And the answer turned out, I was right. No, you can't.
Do you recall, did the department ask you first or Dr. Collins first to terminate?
I think
the
it
grant?
went directly to Building 10, Building 1, the director's office.
Is that the NIH director's
Yeah,
office?
yeah. I think it went from the department to NIH to us.
Okay. Were you, prior to your retirement in December of 2022, were you involved in any of the compliance actions NIH took against EcoHealth?
I don't believe so. I think the actual, and again, I'm a little unclear about the time, but I think most of the disciplinary actions actually occurred after I left, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, the actual suspension and debarment occurred after you left, but there were a number of letters requesting lab notebooks or further information while you were still there.
What happened, Mitch, and it's important to point this out, once it was clear that there was compliance issues while I was still there, we were told at NIAID, stay out of it. Compliance is going to be handled by Building 1, i.e. the NIH director, and Mike Lauer. So the compliance was said, don't touch it, don't go near it, just we'll take care of it.
And you just brought this up, since the original termination, then suspension, NIH found numerous major violations of grant policies, has since debarred the Wuhan Institute of Virology and suspended and proposed for debarment both EcoHealth as an institution and Dr. Daszak individually. Are you aware of those?
Yes, I am.
During previous TIs and hearings, when asked if they supported every one of these actions and supported the suspension and debarment, both Dr. Collins and Dr. Tabak said yes. Sitting here today, do you support the suspension and debarment of EcoHealth?
Yes.
I want to move on to the kind of like known unknowns of COVID origins, to quote Dr. Lipkin's paper from early 2020. On October 20th, 2021, Dr. Tabak sent a letter to then Ranking Member Mr. Comer that said the bat coronaviruses studied under the EcoHealth Alliance grant could not have been the source of SARS-CoV-2 and the COVID-19 pandemic. You've testified similarly both back in January and today. Some of the things that I believe Chairman Griffith brought up was just kind of that statement results on some things, rests on some things that we just can't know. In your experience, Dr. Fauci, do researchers publish every virus that they sequence?
No, I mean, I think researchers don't always publish every single thing they do.
Do they routinely publish every experiment that they conduct?
I'm sure there are people who don't publish every single experiment that they do.
And then is there a lag time between the sampling, the analysis, and the publication?
Yeah, I mean, publications often take months before they come out.
Is it possible, if not plausible, that EcoHealth and the Wuhan Institute of Virology have samples from between 2020 when they originally published a paper, or excuse me, 2015 when they originally published a paper with all of their samples, and now that are unpublished?
Sure, it's possible, but Mitch, I might just throw in there, you can't get away from the fact that the viruses that were studied, that the NIH gave them a grant to study, don't pull back on the fact that no matter what you did with those viruses, they were phylogenetically so different, they could not possibly be the precursor of SARS-CoV-2.
And I agree with that. I guess my only point is that you don't know all the viruses they were working with.
Yeah, and let's make that clear because Congressman Griffith asked it, and I answered you quite honestly, that none of us can know everything that's going on in China or in Wuhan or what have you. And that's the reason why I say today, and I've said at the TI, I keep an open mind as to what the origin is.
The last topic I want to touch on is gain of function. We touched on it in January. You touched on it a little bit today. I know the pandemic has resulted, as I'm sure you're aware, with a rather large debate, and including with the NSABB updating their dangerous research policies surrounding gain of function, P3CO, and dual use research of concern. Prior to October of 2021, the NIH website listed gain of function as a type of research that modifies a biological agent so that it confers new or enhanced activity to that agent. And the P3CO framework that the U.S. government uses to further regulate a subpart of that research that is more dangerous, specifically that could cause widespread and uncontrolled death or disease in humans. Putting aside what's regulatory, I agree with you, the P3CO definition is regulatory. Are there types of research that could fall under the broad definition but not the P3CO definition?
Well, I believe members on the minority side have mentioned that. Influenza is a gain of function to a virus to make it grow better in eggs. Making an E. coli manufacture insulin is telling the E. coli to do something it wasn't able to do before by mutations. Of course that's the case.
So in kind of the Venn diagram of this research, something could fall under gain of function without falling under further regulation.
I know where you're going and you're not going to get there, but go ahead.
According to EcoHealth's Year 5 progress report, they facilitated an experiment in Wuhan that had 7 mice infected with Wuhan Institute of Virology 1 as the backbone, 5 survived. Then 8 mice were infected with a chimera of WIV1 and the spike from another virus, and 2 survived. In EcoHealth's own words, these results suggest that the pathogenicity of that full-length chimera is higher than others.
Right.
You were asked today, and it was read back to you a little bit, but on May 16th, just a few weeks ago, Ms. Lesko asked Dr. Tabak, did NIH fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology through EcoHealth? And Dr. Tabak answered, if you're speaking about the generic term, yes, we did.
Right.
On May 11th, you were asked a similar question, and you answered the NIH has not ever and does not now fund gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I'm going to ask it, and you can answer it how you want to answer it. According to the broad definition of gain-of-function research and the definition Dr. Tabak was testifying pursuant to, did NIAID fund gain-of-function research via EcoHealth in Wuhan?
The broad definition of gain of function, in my mind, is not applicable here and does nothing but confuse the situation. And that is the reason why, after 3 years of deliberation by the bodies, including the NSABB, as well as the national academies, it was decided to make an operative and regulatory definition. If you hearken back to the original broad definition, it does nothing but confuse people. And that's why every time I have mentioned gain of function at the Senate hearing with Senator Paul and the TI, and today, the definition that I use is not my personal definition. It's a codified, regulatory, and operative definition made by a body that has nothing to do with me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I now recognize the minority staff for not longer than 30 minutes.
Dr. Fauci, nice to see you. We've covered many different topics today. We just want to make sure that you have the opportunity to provide your full perspective on any and all of them. Is there anything you'd like to add, clarify, or say about any of the topics we've discussed here today?
We've covered just about everything, but if you come up with something you want to ask me, I'd be happy to try to fill it in, but I think we've been rather extensive today.
I think that's great, and I think we agree, and so with that, we'll yield back the remainder of our time.
I'd like to yield to the ranking member Ruiz for a closing statement if he would like one.
Dr. Fauci, I'd like to thank you for your testimony today, and I would like to thank you for your decades of service to our nation, especially with the HIV epidemic that our nation suffered through, the pandemic flu, Ebola, Zika, and COVID-19, and your years of research and investment that led to the rapid development of the COVID-19 vaccine that saved millions of lives. Thank you. And over the past 4 years, you have been personally targeted by extreme narratives about the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic and the U.S. government's response to it. They began in force in retaliation to wisdom you offered that contradicted the reckless and dangerous therapeutic recommendations by President Trump and have remained part of House Republicans' political playbook. These extreme narratives have been the bedrock of the Select Subcommittee's Republican-led probe and the untenable inferences they've somehow drawn despite the overwhelming evidence that it is inconvenient to those narratives. I want to be clear, the evidence uncovered from more than 425,000 pages of documents and 20 closed-door interviews of current and former federal officials has undermined the extreme narratives behind Republicans' own probe. As I alluded to at the beginning of this hearing, my Democratic colleagues and I are committed to speaking objectively and truthfully about what the evidence shows, and this is what it shows. Dr. Fauci did not fund research through the EcoHealth Alliance grant that caused the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Fauci did not lie about gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China. Dr. Fauci did not orchestrate a campaign to suppress the lab leak theory. These findings are apparent from the evidence. In fact, this much was clear by the time of Dr. Fauci's 2-day transcribed interview this past January. In the 5 months since, the Select Subcommittee has conducted several more closed-door interviews and reviewed several thousand more pages of documents. This additional evidence in Dr. Fauci's testimony today has only made Republicans' claims less plausible and more preposterous. And when I was named ranking member of the Select Subcommittee, I made a commitment to follow the facts in objectively analyzing the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Select Subcommittee is to meaningfully improve our nation's preparedness for future pandemics, then we must take an objective approach to the factual and scientific evidence available to us. The origins of the COVID-19 pandemic remain uncertain. I would like to remind my Republican colleagues that uncertainty is not an opportunity for them to author fiction for partisan gain. It could have been a lab leak, and it could have been an animal transmission. And at the cost of meaningfully advancing our understanding of COVID-19's origins, Republicans have levied extreme allegations of creating SARS-CoV-2 against Dr. Fauci. The result is that Republicans' own probe has failed to shed any additional light on a central question for our select subcommittee. In fact, we're actually entering the fourth quarter of this Congress and this select subcommittee on corona's pandemic. And what have we focused on? It's not an objective investigation on the origin as either lab leak or animal transmission. We have spent the vast majority of time, like in this hearing, with Republicans trying to prove that Dr. Fauci and Collins funded research through EcoHealth that created the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And in order for that to be true, it is dependent on proving the lab leak theory to be true. So it has not been an objective investigation as to whether or not the virus came from a lab or an animal transmission in order to prevent and prepare for the next pandemic. It has been to push this narrative. And this hearing is their climax, their star witness to finally prove their narrative. And they did not do so. Instead of focusing on solutions like fortifying our public health workforce and infrastructure, securing domestic supply chain of vital public health equipment and medications, or equipping schools, churches, synagogues, mosques, businesses to safely stay open during the next deadly novel viral pandemic. Instead, they focused on accusations without evidence. And it seemed like even though the evidence was there that the accusations were false, it didn't matter. They still accused him on a cover-up, suppressing the truth, that he initiated, prompted, or edited the Proximal Origins paper, that he funded a gain of research that created the SARS-CoV-2 virus, even that he received royalties. You know, his answers today and his transcribed interviews and his countless emails refuted all of this. They always have. And his testimony today did again. But that, I guess that doesn't matter for the majority. The truth is that there is no evidence to prove this narrative that we spent so much time addressing. Their accusations are without evidence, but it doesn't matter to them. Intentionally misleading the public is propagating disinformation, and it's wrong and dangerous not only because it manufactures distrust in our public health leaders and our public health agencies, but also because it targets Dr. Fauci and other public health officials for violent death threats. Dr. Fauci just said that anytime anybody alludes to the false accusation that he created the COVID-19 pandemic, his death threats go up. But irresponsibly and recklessly, members on this subcommittee continued to accuse him of that. So for the remaining months of the Select Subcommittee, I reaffirm my commitment to take a serious, balanced look at the question and the possibilities of whether the novel coronavirus emerged from a lab or from nature. And I emphasize to my colleagues that any uncertainty about those origins is an opportunity for us to work constructively together on forward-looking measures to improve our nation's readiness for future public health threats. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you again, Dr. Fauci. I want to thank you for coming here today. I, again, truly appreciate your willingness to come voluntarily before this select committee for both your transcribed interview and hearing today. You know, this hearing was an opportunity to learn about our COVID-19 response and how we can improve and do better. And we did some good things during that, and I'll cite Operation Warp Speed as one of them. It's also an opportunity to more closely examine the office in which you served, because there seemed to be some significant wrongdoings that took place, and I believe that we can make changes and prevent that from happening in the future. That's my goal. It's an opportunity to take a close look about the processes and the procedures in place in our health institutions in the United States. That's our job as oversight in Congress. That's what we're supposed to do. I don't know what playbook some are talking about, because it's been my goal as chairman, and I think you've seen the staff behaving the same way, to take a hard look at the facts so that we can do better in the future. I know that at the end of the transcribed interview, not only during the interview, we talked about other types of vaccines we may be able to create, mucosal vaccines, maybe inhibitors of furin, if there's a furin cleavage site as part of the vaccine. I appreciated that conversation so very much. And at the end, you thanked me for the fairness. And we had the opportunity to share a lot that day. I think what I'm most concerned about as we go forward as a country and from our agencies is that we can be trusted and that we are better in our messaging and talk about clarity. Dr. McCormick today talked about what it was like actually treating COVID patients day in and day out. I had recommended early on that America needed to hear more from doctors that were treating COVID patients, what they were seeing, what was working, what was not working. I compared it to General Schwarzkopf during the Gulf War. Everyone tuned in every night to hear what General Schwarzkopf had to say, not the politician, but what the general in charge had to say. And I think that was important, the one who was in the trenches. But look, you know, we've gone back and forth on the definition of gain of function. I think it's been pretty clear what was you said was on your mind, and there were two different definitions, if you will, a generic definition and an operative regulatory definition. But so, you know, when we go through this, and what America hears is that you say NIH did not fund, and Dr. Tabak said NIH did fund. Clarity matters. I think it would have helped when you were in front of Dr. Paul in the Senate, if you were clear about what you meant. The American people had never heard of gain of function until this came about. Clarity matters. You know, when we conducted great trials on the vaccines, I thought they were phenomenal. Normally you have 8,000 to 10,000 people. We had about 40,000 people in each one of the trials. And what we knew from the trials is that, one, it saved a lot of lives. That's one thing. But we also knew that if you got vaccinated, you could still get COVID. We didn't make that clear to the American people, in my mind. And that you could still get sick. And so if someone stands up, not you, but if someone stands up and says, if you get vaccinated, you're never going to go to the ICU and you're not going to die. Well, that was still happening. So where was the messaging? I wish you would have corrected that right then and there. You know, President says, oh, maybe we just inject bleach. Well, some people maybe thought that was serious. We made it clear it was not. And that was important. But here we have Operation Warp Speed, which I know firsthand you were working on, and you were kind enough to work with the Doctors Caucus to explain what was going on with Operation Warp Speed. And we have a presidential candidate who says, well, if that's developed, I'm not taking it. And I'm paraphrasing. And then takes it. The American public deserve a lot better from their government. And what should have been a 9/11 moment for this country, this pandemic, was turned into a political nightmare. We need to do better. These are agnostic issues, not political. And I think from what we have learned from you in the TI and here today, there's a lot of things that we can do better. And the grant process being one of them. I mean, if you, look, when I sign a prescription, I'm responsible for it. Somebody needs to be responsible. And if you're signing for grants but not responsible for it, you just sign it, then you're not responsible for the dollars that are going out. And then maybe it's the advisory committee that needs to be signing the grant so that there's some level of responsibility and responsibility for compliance. I think that's one of the biggest lessons learned through all this. We can do better. America's a great country. We can fix our problems. But we have to take a good hard look at what we did, what we didn't do, be honest with ourselves, be better in our messaging to the American people, especially when it comes to health. And that's why I felt it was very important that we don't do things like mandates, but let patients have a conversation with the doctor that they know and trust, and make sure that we're getting the doctors all the information and data that they need. From adverse effects of the vaccine, which we've always done, adverse effects of the vaccine, to what the vaccine can and can't do, whether you're at risk or not at risk, what are your risks? Those are personal conversations that need to take place. And I look forward to trying to establish a system that does a better job at that. I'm going to conclude and just say thank you once again, Dr. Fauci. Matter of fact, I'd be glad to have more off-the-record conversations about things we can do in the future, drugs we may be able to develop, treatments we may be able to provide, and vaccines we may be able to produce. And so if you're amenable, I might reach out to you for that, and other scientists as well that may have varying opinions. So again, thank you again for being the witness today. With that and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit materials and to submit additional written questions for the witnesses, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. If there's no further business, without objection, the Select Subcommittee stands adjourned.